Chapter 1. As the human soul at the edge of itself, there are writers who describe the world, and there are writers who confront the world as if it were a question addressed directly to the soul. Dostoevsky belongs to the second kind. His philosophy does not come in the form of pristine arguments or neat treatises. It comes in the form of trembling human beings standing at the edge of moral collapse, delirium, crime, repentance, and revelation. His pages are battlefields of conscience. A Dostoevskian thought is not an idea. It is a psychological explosion. This is the first point of divergence with the others in our constellation. Where Marcus Aurelius, writing in the quiet hours of imperial duty, teaches himself how to stay inwardly unshaken, how to make the soul still while the world howls, Dostoevsky throws the soul into the inferno and watches what survives the fire. Where Machiavelli, looking at princes and principalities, concerns himself with the logic of power, with what must be done when morality interferes with survival, Dostoevsky asks what survival means if the soul rots in the process. And where Nietzsche, writing with the sharpness of a cold blade, seeks to liberate mankind from the disease of guilt, pity, and Christian metaphysics in order to give birth to a new kind of being, Dostoevsky answers him decades beforehand in fictional form. If you kill God in the metaphysical sense, you do not only kill doctrine, you kill the interior structure of man. To Dostoevsky, the death of God is not a philosophical liberation, it is a psychological catastrophe. This is why his novels are full of characters who test the limits of moral law, not to reaffirm piety automatically, but to show what becomes of human subjectivity when transcendence is removed. He does not construct a syllogism. He lets Raskolnikov murder an old pawnbroker and then follows the corrosion of his soul like a doctor follows a disease. Nietzsche would admire the break with herd morality, and then condemn the collapse that follows as weakness and leftover Christian conscience. Marcus Aurelius would see in Raskolnikov not a rebel, but a man ruled by passions instead of reason, failing the stoic demand of internal command. Machiavelli, cold-eyed, might consider whether the murder achieved the intended utility, and if not, the failure lies not in the morality, but in the execution, the strategy. Dostoevsky stands apart. He does not measure actions by outcome or by rational self-government or by strength. He measures them by what they do to the inner drama of the soul. Beneath all his narratives lies a thesis not stated but enacted. Man is not just a reasoning creature, nor just a beast of will, nor just a political instrument. He is a metaphysical battleground between freedom and conscience. Where the Stoic makes man a disciplined citadel, where the Florentine makes man a calculating ruler, where the German iconoclast makes man an artist of power, the Russian makes man a sinner standing before eternity. And his philosophy, if we may call it that, begins from the certainty that freedom without a sacred axis does not elevate man, but disintegrates him from within. The rest of this work will orbit this clash between freedom and responsibility, between transcendent order and human rebellion, between the inward stillness of virtue, Aurelius, the ruthless necessity of power, Machiavelli, the proud self-creation of the Übermensch, Nietzsche, and Dostoevsky's trembling insistence that man is not merely earthly. Before we go to the duel of these worldviews in concrete themes, God, suffering, freedom, guilt, state, morality, we must first descend fully into Dostoevsky's world, not the surface events of his plots, but the underlying spiritual anatomy he exposes. Chapter 2. The Underground as a Map of the Modern Soul. Before Nietzsche declared that God is dead, Dostoevsky had already written the obituary in the voice of a ruined man, the underground man. He is not a nihilist in the heroic, triumphant sense Nietzsche envisioned, but a nihilist in the pathological, paralyzed, self-eating sense. A man who refuses every moral and rational framework, not out of strength, but out of spite against the universe itself. He is modern man without transcendence, naked, intelligent, and spiritually poisoned. Dostoevsky uses him not to argue, but to demonstrate. When authority over meaning is handed entirely to the ego does not become sovereign. It becomes sick. Nietzsche looks at guilt and calls it a slave construct. Dostoevsky looks at the same guilt and sees an X-ray of the human soul, evidence that man is not just a creature of appetite or reason, but a being structured to answer to something higher than himself, even if defying it. Marcus Aurelius would find in the underground man the exact opposite of Stoicism, a mind without discipline, without order, without mastery of inner impressions. To the Stoic, such psychic chaos is the root of suffering. The cure is not transcendence, but training of judgment, to live in accord with nature and reason. Machiavelli would regard the underground man as functionally useless. He neither acts shrewdly in politics nor gains anything from his rebellion. He is an example of rebellion without utility, all poison, no power. It is Nietzsche who would pause the longest. Here is the failure case of the godless man, not the liberated creator, but the cynical invalid. Nietzsche would diagnose him as someone who killed God but kept the guilt mechanism, a man still chained psychologically to the morality he claims to reject. He wants freedom from moral law, but he still measures himself by it. That, to Nietzsche, is the worst weakness, to be metaphysically orphaned yet still morally tormented. Dostoevsky agrees with Nietzsche about the symptom, but not the cure. Nietzsche says, kill pity, kill guilt, kill humility. Become harder, rise higher. Dostoevsky says, if you kill those, you amputate what makes man human. Where Nietzsche extracts the iron from the soul, Dostoevsky examines the wound beneath. The underground man is a thought experiment in narrative form. What if man is given total intellectual freedom with no sacred ceiling? What grows in him, clarity or madness? For Marcus Aurelius, the answer would be, such a mind collapses because it is untrained. For Machiavelli, such a mind collapses because it produces no advantage. For Nietzsche, such a mind collapses because it lacks the courage to metabolize godlessness. For Dostoevsky, such a mind collapses because the soul without transcendence is structurally unstable. This is not yet his final philosophy, but the first stratum. He begins by diagnosing the modern inner condition, not with a lecture, but with a man rotting from within in full consciousness of it. The next step in Dostoevsky's philosophy is not just negation, but confrontation with the deepest forces within man. Temptation, guilt, and the idea that suffering is not just accidental, but structurally embedded in existence. Chapter 3, Suffering as the Doorway to Truth. Dostoevsky builds his philosophy on a premise that modern man spends his life trying to escape. That suffering is not a detour of existence, it is the central avenue by which the soul is revealed. In his novels, love without suffering is shallow, faith without suffering is untested, freedom without suffering is delusion. He does not romanticize pain, he treats it as the only solvent strong enough to strip illusions off the human being. Nietzsche also gives suffering a central role, but for the opposite reason. To Nietzsche, suffering is necessary not for revelation of the soul, but for the forging of strength. Pain is the whetstone on which will is sharpened. He despises pity precisely because pity interrupts the developmental necessity of suffering. The weak want to anesthetize life, the strong ride the storm and become something new. Marcus Aurelius stands at a third coordinate. Suffering is neither revelation nor forge, but indifferent raw material. What matters is the judgment we attach to it. Stoicism seeks to drain suffering of its emotional poison by reframing it. You are upset not by what happens, but by your opinion of what happens. To the Stoic, suffering is a test of internal discipline. Can you remain sovereign over your mind while reality injures your body or fortune? Machiavelli, characteristically unsentimental, treats suffering as cost, an expense sometimes necessary for power or survival. He does not ask what it means, he asks what it buys. If cruelty prevents greater chaos, it is justified. If suffering delivers stability, it is strategic. And then Dostoevsky returns with a fourth vision altogether. Not utility, Machiavelli, not mastery, Aurelius, not transformation of strength, Nietzsche, but revelation of interior truth. In Dostoevsky's world, a man learns who he is not when things are fair, but when things break. It is in the cell, in fever, in guilt, in humiliation, in loss of dignity, that the final layer of pretense falls. This insistence on spiritual anthropology, not metaphysics on a chalkboard, but metaphysics under pressure, is his signature. Nietzsche rejects the moral interpretation of suffering. Dostoevsky rejects the attempt to strip suffering of morality. Nietzsche says, suffering is innocent, only power matters. Dostoevsky replies, Suffering without moral horizon corrodes the soul rather than tempers it. Marcus Aurelius would attempt to hold calm over chaos. Dostoevsky sinks into the chaos to diagnose it. Machiavelli would ask whether suffering alters political reality. Dostoevsky asks whether it alters ultimate destiny. At the center of his thought is this: a human being is never more himself than when he is in agony. What he believes about God, freedom, guilt, meaning, all is exposed when suffering strips away comfort. But if suffering reveals, what does it reveal about freedom? If man remains free even when crushed, or if he becomes monstrous when unconstrained, then freedom itself must be examined next. Chapter 4. Freedom as catastrophe and command. For most Western philosophy, freedom is regarded as a prize, the condition under which man becomes fully himself. For Dostoevsky, freedom is not immediately good. It is volatile, dangerous, even destructive when unmoored. His characters repeatedly show a disturbing truth. Give man total freedom, and he will often use it to humiliate, corrupt, or destroy, first himself, then others. Where others see freedom as liberation, Dostoevsky sees freedom as a test that most souls fail. Nietzsche would answer, they fail not because freedom is corrupting, but because they remain psychologically Christian even after abandoning God. They are still ashamed of their instincts. Freedom demands a new morality invented from strength, not inherited guilt. Marcus Aurelius, freedom is inner, not outer. Even a slave can be free if he masters himself. Even an emperor is a slave if he does not. The Stoic would say the chaos Dostoevsky describes is simply misgoverned mind, not a metaphysical problem. Machiavelli, freedom is a resource, a strategic privilege. It is only good insofar as it allows effective rule. If men misuse freedom, then restricting them is not immoral. It is prudent governance. He begins not from internal crisis, but from external order. People are to be managed, not cured. Dostoevsky refuses all three. He is not speaking of freedom as external latitude, Machiavelli, nor freedom as internal rational composure, Aurelius, nor freedom as a precondition for self-overcoming, Nietzsche. He means something darker, freedom as the terrible permission to do what conscience does not forbid, until conscience itself is destroyed. His question is theological in depth, even when narrated psychologically. If man is free and God is silent, what prevents him from turning into a demon with a legal passport? Nietzsche answers, nothing should prevent it, if the demon is strong. Stoicism answers, reason will restrain and civilize. Machiavelli answers, the state will restrain when reason fails. Dostoevsky answers, without a sacred interior law, reason and state become accomplices to evil, not barriers. This is why the Grand Inquisitor, one of his most penetrating philosophical constructions, argues that most human beings do not want freedom at all. They want to be relieved of the burden of choosing good. They will trade their souls for bread, miracle, and authority. Freedom terrifies them because it exposes them to judgment without excuses. Nietzsche sees this terror and despises it. He calls for men to grow beyond the need for moral anesthesia. Marcus Aurelius seeks to tame the mind so the terror dissipates. Machiavelli exploits the terror to rule. Dostoevsky stares at the terror and says, this fear is evidence, evidence that man is a creature answerable to something higher than human law or opinion. It is not weakness, it is ontology. To understand why he takes that view, we must go to the deepest tectonic layer of his philosophy. Guilt, not as social construct, not as manipulable emotion, but as metaphysical fact. Chapter 5. Guilt and the unerasable witness. What makes Dostoevsky's moral universe distinct is not that people do wrong, every thinker admits that, but that wrongdoing leaves an ineradicable imprint on the inner life. In his world, guilt is not merely emotional discomfort, nor a social invention, nor a theological superstition. It is the soul catching itself in the act. You can silence courts, evade police, rewrite history, rationalize behavior, but the interior witness does not forget. Nietzsche rejects this. For him, guilt is a historical accident, a weapon the weak invented to tame the strong. To carry guilt is to remain chained to the morality one should have killed. True liberation lies in amputating that inner witness. Marcus Aurelius treats guilt not as metaphysical, but as logical error. If you acted wrongly, correct yourself. Do not torture yourself. Guilt is only useful if it leads to present virtue. Otherwise, it is noise. Machiavelli nearly dismisses guilt altogether. A prince must be able to do necessary evil without inner collapse. Psychology is irrelevant. Outcomes decide legitimacy. If guilt weakens execution, it is a liability. Dostoevsky stands alone and says, "The inability to erase guilt is not weakness, it is diagnostic. It tells us something about what man is." He portrays guilt not as a social residue, but as something the soul experiences even when no eye has seen, and no one will ever know. That is the essence. A crime without witness still burns. The torment is strongest when outward absolution exists, but inner absolution does not. Nietzsche would call that internal torment a self-imposed prison. Dostoevsky would answer, "It is not imposed, it is discovered." If man were merely a biological machine or a power will, guilt would dissolve with justification. But in Dostoevsky, even when reason declares an act necessary or deserved, the soul does not fully accept the verdict. The friction remains. Something higher than logic is sitting in judgment. This is the unerased witness, what his characters encounter when they descend far enough inside themselves that excuses stop working. And that is why his novels so often drive sinners toward confession. Not because society demands it, but because concealment becomes unendurable. Nietzsche would say confession is capitulation. Machiavelli would say confession is stupidity if it weakens position. Marcus Aurelius would say one must accept error calmly and repair through virtue. Dostoevsky says confession is metaphysical realism, the soul attempting to re-enter alignment with a reality larger than itself. But if guilt is ineradicable, does redemption exist, or only torment? Does Dostoevsky offer cure or only diagnosis? To answer that, we must confront the force he sees as guilt's twin, love not as sentiment but as metaphysical power, the one force that can transfigure suffering rather than merely explain it. Chapter 6. Love, Humiliation, and the Reversal of Power. In most philosophical systems, love is treated gently, as benevolence, as virtue, as mutual goodwill, as a civilizing force. Dostoevsky treats love with far more brutality and depth. In his world, love is impossible without humiliation. Not humiliation by others, but the humiliation of the self before truth. Love is not kindness, it is exposure. It requires a person to admit his poverty of soul, to bow before another's reality, to relinquish the illusion of sovereign ego. It does not flatter man, it breaks him. That is why so many of his characters flee from love more than from prison or pain. Love demands the surrender of pride. Nietzsche would object immediately. Humiliation is the residue of slave morality. Love of this kind weakens the self and prevents ascent. To love is permissible only if it affirms strength, not dissolves it. Marcus Aurelius would allow love, but purified of dependence and passion. Stoic love is calm, rational, without inner servitude. There is no humiliation in it, only appropriate regard. Machiavelli treats love as strategically inferior to fear. A ruler should not rely on love because love dissolves under pressure. Humiliation is a tool, not a virtue. Dostoevsky answers all three not with argument, but with anthropology. The human ego is too armored for truth until it is cracked. Pride must die before the soul can love, and that death feels like humiliation. He observes what Nietzsche refuses. The ego does not evolve by being strengthened, it evolves by being unmasked. He sees what the Stoic denies. Reason alone cannot reorder the soul. Without a break in pride, the inner architecture remains untouched, and he sees what Machiavelli ignores. A society built on fear and calculation may be stable, but it does not save the human interior from slow spiritual rot. In Dostoevsky, love is the counterforce to nihilism, not because it is gentle, but because it destroys the ego's false center and reveals the soul's true dependence. It is a metaphysical revolution disguised as an emotional event. But love alone is not his endpoint. If humiliation reveals truth and love reconciles the soul, the philosophical climax lies elsewhere, in the face of death. Dostoevsky believed that nothing clarifies the human condition more than the proximity of annihilation. A firing squad, a sentence, a terminal illness, a final hour. Where Nietzsche sees death as a spur to affirm life, where Marcus Aurelius sees it as a natural reabsorption into the cosmos, where Machiavelli sees it as political endpoint, Dostoevsky sees it as the moment when every mask falls and the soul stands naked. The final contradiction, God, death, and meaning, begins now. Chapter 7. The face of death and the final judge. Dostoevsky nearly died by firing squad. That moment is not biographical trivia. It is the furnace in which his philosophy hardened. When the blindfold is almost on, all abstractions die. What remains is the final inventory of the soul. Everything his characters later enact comes from that single revelation. When death is near, truth is immediate, and excuses lose jurisdiction. How each of our four thinkers meets death. Marcus Aurelius looks at death like a Stoic mathematician, a rearrangement of atoms, a return to nature. Death removes anxiety because it is rationally inevitable. Machiavelli treats death as an external terminus. Timing and optics matter politically. What it means internally is irrelevant. Nietzsche faces death as a test of affirmation. One must die as one lived, without resentment, without appeal to otherworldly meaning. Dostoevsky sees death as courtroom, not in the social or legal sense, but metaphysical. The soul discovers whether it has a ground deeper than fear, ego, or rationalization. None of his novels allow death to be a neutral event. Death is a revealer. The proud become terrified. The guilty tremble. The self-justifier loses his shield. The believer discovers if he truly believes. To Nietzsche, this is precisely the slavery he rejects. To tremble before a cosmic judge is to confess dependence. To Dostoevsky, the trembling proves the judge is real, not externally, but inwardly inscribed. This is the crux of their opposition. Nietzsche wants a man who does not bow before anything. Dostoevsky warns that a man who bows before nothing eventually bows before himself and destroys himself. Where Stoicism anesthetizes fear by leveling death into nature, where Machiavelli bypasses the inner question for external necessity, Dostoevsky insists on the one thing they evade. There is something in man that demands an answer to more than nature and utility, and the demand intensifies precisely at the edge of extinction. If death uncloaks the soul, then the next question is unavoidable. Is there a meaning beyond the grave, or is meaning merely a psychological strategy to endure life? The next movement, therefore, must confront the final tension. God or the abyss. Chapter 8. God, the void, and the last possibility of man. Dostoevsky's entire philosophical system is suspended between two vertical possibilities. God exists, and therefore conscience, guilt, love, sacrifice, and moral order are not illusions but disclosures of a higher reality. God does not exist, and therefore every moral intuition is a byproduct, every virtue is contingent, and nothing binds the human animal from within. He never treats this as a casual theological debate. For him, these are not two opinions. They are two civilizations of the soul. What a man believes about God reorganizes everything else. Freedom, suffering, love, guilt, death. Nietzsche answers with the most radical alternative. Abolish God and build new value from the will. Do not neuter man with transcendence. If there is no judge, no eternal ledger, no sacred order, then the noble soul must create meaning instead of begging for it. Marcus Aurelius sidesteps the abyss. Even if the gods are uncertain, the logos, rational order, guides the universe. Meaning is not dependent on a personal deity, but on the rationality of nature. The void is not chaos, it is structure without a face. Machiavelli is indifferent to the question. Whether God is real or not is politically irrelevant. What matters is what men believe, not what is metaphysically true. Dostoevsky rejects both indifference and invention. He sees that, if God is merely useful, morality becomes hypocrisy. If God is merely desired, religion becomes therapy. If God is denied, man does not become free. he becomes counterfeit. For Nietzsche, the abyss is the place where the strong build. For Dostoevsky, the abyss is the place where the soul disintegrates. He watched, in himself, in his characters, in the criminals, fanatics, and suicides he studied, that when transcendence collapses, man does not ascend into higher autonomy, but diffuses into contradiction. He still craves goodness, but cannot justify it. He still condemns evil, but cannot ground it. He still loves meaning, but knows it is fiction. Dostoevsky's warning is not theological sentiment. It is forensic psychology. The human animal cannot live honestly in a world without God, without either lying or breaking. Nietzsche would call that weakness. Dostoevsky would call it diagnosis. The two visions now stand fully opposed. Nietzsche killed transcendence to make space for a stronger man. Dostoevsky, without transcendence, the stronger man becomes a justified monster. Marcus Aurelius. Transcendence is optional, virtue is self-legislated. Machiavelli. Transcendence is irrelevant, order is pragmatic. Only one question remains, and it is the one Dostoevsky leaves us with rather than resolves. If God is rejected, what replaces him? And can that replacement bear the full weight of the human soul without cracking? This is the final tension of the book. The epilogue will weave the four philosophies together and extract the final comparative verdict. Epilogue: four answers to the human condition, which one leaves man intact. We now have four architectures of existence, fully exposed. 1. Dostoevsky. Man is a creature with a soul that cannot escape moral truth. Freedom without God decays into cruelty or madness. Suffering reveals the heart. Love shatters pride. Guilt testifies to a law beyond reason. Death unmasks the self. The human being is ultimately answerable. Human problem, not ignorance but rebellion. Solution: humility, confession, love, and a transcendent order. 2. Nietzsche. Man must transcend inherited morality by force of will. Suffering is the forge of greatness. Pity poisons excellence. God is a cage. Guilt is a virus. Death is the field test of affirmation. Value must be created, not received. Human problem: weakness masquerading as virtue. Solution: self-creation without metaphysical crutches. 3. Marcus Aurelius. Stoicism. Man can remain internally sovereign regardless of external chaos. Suffering is neutral. Death is nature. Reason disciplines emotion. Virtue is sufficient. Detachment protects serenity. Human problem: uncontrolled judgment and passion. Solution: rational mastery and inward composure. 4. Machiavelli. Man is driven by necessity, fear, and self-interest. Morality is secondary to stability. Cruelty can be rational. Religion can be useful. Death is strategic endpoint. The real is more important than the ideal. Human problem: disorder and naivete about power. Solution: realism, control, and decisive rule. Now the central question: which of these leaves the human being intact? Not merely functional, not merely powerful, but whole. Machiavelli preserves order but sacrifices conscience. Nietzsche preserves strength but sacrifices innocence and compassion. Stoicism preserves sanity but drains transcendence and ardor. Dostoevsky preserves the soul but demands bowing before what is higher. There is no neutral choice. Each path protects one dimension of man and endangers another. Thinker: what is saved, what is lost. Dostoevsky: soul, meaning, moral depth. Pride, self-sovereignty. Nietzsche: strength, creativity, autonomy. Mercy, sanctity, moral restraint. Marcus Aurelius: inner peace, dignity, control. Passion, transcendence. Machiavelli: stability, realism, efficacy, moral interiority, compassion. This is the final fork. If you believe man is primarily power, you choose Nietzsche or Machiavelli. If you believe man is primarily mind, you choose the Stoic. If you believe man is primarily soul, you end up with Dostoevsky. He does not win philosophically, he accuses. He holds a mirror to the interior and asks whether the image is bearable without God, without forgiveness, without sacred law. Nietzsche says, bear it by becoming stronger. Stoicism says, bear it by becoming calmer. Machiavelli says, bear it by controlling others. Dostoevsky says, bear it by bowing before truth. And the listener is left with the only question Dostoevsky ever really cared about. If you remove God and keep man exactly as he is, can he live without eventually destroying himself? That question is not answered by argument, only by the destiny a man chooses after hearing it. End.